In the summer of 1980, at a private ball later associated with Windsor Castle and the Queen Mother's approaching 80th birthday, Anna Wallace watched Charles spend most of the evening with Camilla Parker Bowles. The familiar version places the scene on the Queen Mother's actual birthday. That date was 4 August 1980. The documented public celebrations, however, took place elsewhere, at Clarence House, with gun salutes in Hyde Park and at the Tower of London, and at the Royal Opera House in Covent Garden. The Windsor gathering appears in later biographical accounts as an earlier private ball, possibly in June, not as a confirmed event on 4 August. That distinction matters because almost every vivid detail of the story comes from accounts written years afterward. No contemporary guest list in the surviving research identifies Wallace and Camilla at this particular ball. No recording preserves the conversation. No interview by Wallace supplies her own complete version. The broad sequence is repeated across royal biographies. Charles arrived with Anna Wallace, spent much of the evening with Camilla. Wallace objected, and the relationship ended. She left. Anna Wallace was the daughter of Hamish Edward Wallace, a Scottish landowner associated with Old Corrimony near Glen Urquhart in Inverness-shire. She belonged to the country house world Charles knew well: hunting fields, polo grounds, estates, formal dances, and the social network that made a prospective royal bride seem less like a stranger and more like a familiar possibility. That background placed her inside Charles's world without making her dependent on it. She knew horses, country society, and the rituals surrounding men with titles. Charles was the heir to the throne. Wallace was a well-connected Scottish heiress and horsewoman who didn't need a royal invitation to acquire status. Her relationship with Charles began late in 1979, according to an account that places their first meeting at a fox hunt in November. Other biographies give only the broader setting, describing their introduction on the hunting field. By January 1980, Wallace was reported at Windsor Polo while Charles played. On 31st January, another account placed her hunting with him on the Cheshire Hunt. The details create a recognizable courtship. They occupied the same physical world before they occupied the same romantic one. Charles hunted and played polo. Wallace hunted and rode. Their social circles overlapped, and she could accompany him without being transformed into a decorative outsider. Later accounts described the relationship as serious enough for Wallace to be considered a plausible future wife. Some reported that Charles proposed to her twice and that she declined both proposals. The proposals can't be confirmed through a surviving letter, palace announcement, diary, or public statement from Wallace, so the safest conclusion is narrower. She was treated by royal observers as one of Charles's serious pre-Diana possibilities, not merely another name in a long list of social companions. That distinction becomes important because Charles's romantic life before Diana wasn't a clean sequence of relationships, each beginning and ending independently. Camilla Shand, later Camilla Parker Bowles, had been romantically connected to Charles in the early 1970s. She married Andrew Parker Bowles on 4 July 1973, but royal biographers place her back in Charles's emotional orbit by the late 1970s, with the exact timing and nature of the renewed relationship disputed. Charles's own later account, given to Jonathan Dimbleby, placed the resumption of an adulterous affair in 1986, after his marriage to Diana had irretrievably broken down. Other biographers place renewed intimacy with Camilla earlier, around 1978 or 1979. The record does not settle the precise sexual status of the relationship on the night Wallace confronted Charles. It does establish Camilla's continuing presence. That presence was visible in the same social world where Charles was expected to identify a wife. Wallace was the woman being considered. Camilla was the woman who remained close. The first warning is often described as a polo incident. The problem is that the surviving accounts don't securely identify one specific polo match in which Charles left Wallace with friends and went elsewhere. Later retellings use phrases such as polo ball, while Penny Junor's more detailed version refers instead to 2 successive formal balls. The difference isn't trivial. A polo match, A polo ball, a ball at Stowell Park, and a private event at Windsor Castle may have been combined by later writers into one dramatic episode. What can be stated with greater confidence is that Juner's account describes Charles taking Wallace to 2 successive balls and spending most of both evenings dancing with Camilla. The first event was reportedly at Stowell Park in Gloucestershire, associated with the Vesti family. The second was connected in later accounts with Windsor Castle. The dates aren't securely established. The sequence is. Wallace wasn't confronted by one unexplained absence. In the most detailed version of the story, she watched the same choice recur across 2 formal evenings. Charles brought her as his companion. Camilla received his attention. That pattern is the evidence. The polo label is less secure. For Charles, the arrangement may have appeared socially manageable. He could remain close to Camilla while appearing publicly with a woman considered suitable for marriage. The sources don't prove that Charles consciously designed a system to use Wallace as cover, and they don't show Camilla plotting to displace her. What they show is conduct. Charles's attention repeatedly moved toward Camilla, while Wallace was left to absorb the meaning of it. By the time the Windsor event arrived, the humiliation was no longer theoretical. The Queen Mother, Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes Lyon, was born on 4th August 1900. Her 80th birthday in 1980 generated a series of celebrations, including the public Thanksgiving service at St. Paul's Cathedral on 15th July and the gala at Covent Garden on 4 August. Later accounts place Charles, Wallace, and Camilla at a private ball held during the summer celebrations, but the exact date, guest list, room, and movements inside the castle aren't independently documented. So the scene should be imagined carefully. A formal evening event. Windsor Castle in the later accounts. Anna Wallace present with Charles. Camilla present. Charles spending most of the evening with Camilla. The surviving evidence does not confirm Wallace's dress. It does not confirm that Charles walked across the room from her side. It does not establish that he spent every remaining minute with Camilla. Penny Juner's wording, as repeated in later reporting, is more restrained. Charles danced with Camilla for most of both evenings. That is enough. A woman does not need to watch every minute of a night to understand who has been chosen as the emotional center of it. Later accounts attribute different words to Wallace. Penny Juner's version gives her the line, "No one treats me like that, not even you." Other retellings report a longer complaint. "I have never been so badly treated in my life. You've left me all alone all evening, and now you will have to continue without me." Neither quotation comes from a contemporaneous transcript or an on-the-record interview with Wallace. They are reconstructed and transmitted through secondary sources. The exact wording should therefore remain attributed, not presented as recorded dialogue. The meaning, however, is consistent across the versions. Wallace objected to being publicly sidelined while Charles devoted himself to Camilla. She didn't accept an apology in the available record. She didn't return to the relationship. She didn't negotiate a new understanding. The relationship ended in the summer of 1980. That is the quiet force of the story. Wallace didn't merely recognize that Charles loved someone else. She recognized the position Charles was offering her. Proximity to the heir, public suitability, and the expectation that she would tolerate an emotional arrangement in which another woman remained central. Then, she refused the position. The research record contains no full first-hand account from Wallace. There is no memoir explaining her motives, no published letter describing the ball, and no interview in which she narrates the relationship from beginning to end. Her silence limits what can honestly be claimed about her private emotions. The evidence supports anger, objection, and finality. It does not support describing her as secretly heartbroken or emotionally destroyed. The phrase, "she saved herself," is an interpretation. The documented facts are more solid. She ended the relationship, didn't publicly return to it, and married John Fermor Hesketh on 2 December 1980 at the Guards Chapel in Wellington Barracks, according to later reports. The sources differ over his exact family designation. He is described as Johnny Fermor Hesketh, variously the youngest son of the second or third Lord Hesketh, or a brother of Lord Hesketh. The peerage detail is inconsistent, but the marriage date is repeatedly reported. Later accounts say the marriage ended in divorce. Wallace's post-Charles life is sparsely documented. Those later details come from weaker secondary profiles, and the absence of public coverage shouldn't be turned into a claim about her motives. What can be said is that Wallace didn't turn the relationship into a public career. She didn't publish a memoir about Charles. She didn't offer an extended account of Camilla. She didn't compete with Diana for ownership of the story. The public was left with fragments supplied by biographers. That silence is part of the reason the surviving narrative can feel more decisive than the evidence allows. A woman who says very little can easily become a character built by other people. In Wallace's case, the outline is repeated often enough to support the broad event, but the interior details remain unavailable. The sources give us a woman from a Scottish estate, a courtship that developed through hunting and polo, a relationship serious enough to attract royal attention, 2 reported formal evenings dominated by Charles's closeness to Camilla, a confrontation, and a permanent departure. They don't give us every thought Wallace had while watching The Room. The decision still stands. Wallace wasn't the only woman before Diana to reject Charles or retreat from the conditions surrounding him. The pattern becomes clearer when the outcomes are separated. Lady Sarah Spencer, Diana's elder sister, dated Charles in 1977 and 1978. She accompanied him to country houses, polo occasions, Windsor, Balmoral, and a skiing holiday at Cloisters. During the relationship, she gave an interview in which she reportedly said, "There is no chance of my marrying him. I'm not in love with him, and I wouldn't marry anyone I didn't love, whether he were the dustman or the King of England." The publication is inconsistently identified in later accounts, but the quotation is widely repeated. Charles reportedly considered the interview indiscreet and ended the relationship, telling Sarah she had done something extremely stupid. Sarah's case was different from Wallace's. She rejected marriage in public before Charles could offer it as a settled arrangement, and Charles then rejected her for speaking too freely. Her refusal was personal and explicit. Davina Sheffield faced a different outcome. She was treated by royal insiders as a serious possible bride and was invited to lunch with the Queen. Her prospects reportedly ended when a former boyfriend told the press that they had lived together. Under the sexual and reputational standards applied to prospective royal brides at the time, that disclosure was considered disqualifying. Sheffield wasn't removed because she had publicly refused Charles. She was rejected by an institution whose standards were imposed on her. Lady Jane Wellesley, daughter of the 8th Duke of Wellington, was linked with Charles in the early 1970s and was discussed as a potential future queen. Later accounts say she didn't want the press scrutiny and constraints of royal life. The surviving material does not include a direct statement from Wellesley confirming that motive, so it belongs in the category of reported withdrawal rather than settled personal testimony. Amanda Knatchbull, the granddaughter of Lord Louis Mountbatten, was also reportedly considered for Charles. Later accounts say Charles proposed to her around 1979 or 1980, and that she declined because she didn't want the restrictions and public exposure of royal life. These women didn't all make the same choice. Sarah Spencer refused marriage and was then rejected by Charles. Davina Sheffield was judged unsuitable by palace standards. Jane Wellesley reportedly withdrew from the prospect of royal scrutiny. Amanda Knatchbull reportedly declined the restrictions of royal life. Anna Wallace ended a relationship after Charles repeatedly prioritized Camilla in public settings. The common thread isn't that every woman saw Charles in exactly the same way. It's that the expected royal marriage didn't happen automatically. A prospective bride could refuse. She could be refused. She could decide that the institution cost too much. Or she could discover, as Wallace reportedly did, that the man presenting himself as a future husband was still visibly attached to someone else. Charles's position made the process more complicated than an ordinary courtship. He was the heir apparent, and after the death of Lord Louis Mountbatten in 1979, pressure on him to choose a suitable wife intensified. The women around him were often aristocratic, wealthy, socially connected, and familiar to the palace. The question wasn't simply whether Charles found a woman attractive, it was whether she fit an institutional idea of the future queen. Camilla remained central to the story because she didn't fit that role at the time. She was married to Andrew Parker Bowles, and the rules governing the heir's marriage made her an unacceptable choice in the eyes of palace expectations. Yet she remained part of Charles's emotional and social life, while other women were assessed as potential wives. Penny Junor described Charles's earlier relationships as involving women he might present to friends as possible wives, rather than as purely casual affairs. That pattern helps explain Wallace's position. She wasn't merely in a romance with a private man, she was moving through a process in which suitability, public appearance, family approval, and private attachment were all operating at once. Her refusal exposed the conflict between those systems. The woman considered suitable for marriage wasn't necessarily the woman receiving Charles's deepest attention. The woman receiving that attention wasn't necessarily available to become Princess of Wales. A third person could therefore be left carrying the practical cost of a contradiction that the institution preferred to manage quietly. Wallace had information that mattered because she encountered the contradiction directly. Diana Spencer entered the story under different conditions. Diana was born in 1961 and was 19 when her engagement to Charles was announced in February 1981. Charles was 32 when they married on 29th of July 1981 at St. Paul's Cathedral. The marriage came roughly 11 months after Wallace's reported breakup. Charles had met Diana years earlier through Sarah Spencer in 1977. The serious courtship developed later, after the Wallace relationship had ended. That chronology matters, because Diana wasn't a complete stranger selected from nowhere. But she was still much younger and less experienced than Wallace when the courtship accelerated. The comparison must be made carefully. Diana wasn't without agency. She met Charles, accepted his courtship, and participated in the engagement and marriage. But agency depends on information, time, confidence, and power. Those resources weren't distributed equally between the two women. Wallace moved inside the hunting and polo world as an adult. She had seen Charles's behavior with Camilla at more than one reported formal event. She had already experienced the humiliation she would have been expected to tolerate after marriage. Diana knew Camilla as a friend of Charles. The sources disagree over exactly how much Diana understood about the depth and continuity of their relationship before the wedding. Some accounts portray Camilla as a married friend whose significance Diana only gradually understood. Other retrospective accounts suggest that Diana recognized more of the attachment during the courtship. The record supports limited information more securely than total ignorance. It also supports a major difference in circumstances. Diana was 19, entering a rapidly unfolding royal courtship, while Wallace was older, socially experienced in Charles's world, and responding to conduct she had personally witnessed. Diana's marriage wasn't simply Wallace's decision, repeated by another woman with equal knowledge. The two women didn't stand in the same room with the same information. That is why Wallace matters. Her story does not prove that Diana was foolish. It shows that the conditions surrounding Diana's acceptance were different from those surrounding Wallace's refusal. A woman can make a choice without receiving the evidence needed to evaluate its full cost. The wedding itself later became a symbol of that information gap. Wallace saw Camilla as the woman Charles chose to spend his evening with at a private event. Diana saw Camilla among the congregation at St. Paul's Cathedral on 29 July 1981 and walked up the aisle. The scenes aren't identical. The Windsor Ball is reconstructed from biographies. The wedding is documented by photographs, film, and public records. Wallace's words are attributed after the fact. Diana's marriage is an established event. The contrast remains precise. Wallace had seen Charles prioritize Camilla and ended the relationship about 11 months before the wedding. Diana entered the marriage without an equivalent public demonstration placed directly in front of her, and without the same practical power to walk away from a royal engagement once it had become a national spectacle. The popular response to Wallace reflects that distinction. In one audience discussion, the most liked comment called her a royal bullet dodger. Another said Wallace knew about Camilla and wasn't going to become Charles's cover. A third reversed the usual hierarchy and declared that Charles wasn't good enough for a Wallace woman. Those comments aren't historical evidence. They don't establish what Wallace knew or felt. They reveal how viewers interpret the surviving pattern, as self-protection rather than romantic defeat. That interpretation fits the documented outcome better than a heartbreak narrative does. Wallace didn't spend the rest of her life explaining how badly Charles had hurt her. She didn't become a public witness against him. She ended the relationship and married someone else within months. No source proves that she never spoke to Charles again. No source records whether he apologized privately. The absence of a public reconciliation isn't proof that no private contact occurred. It does show that the story, as reconstructed through later biographies, has one unmistakable direction. 2 reported evenings of public sidelining, 1 recognition, 1 confrontation, 1 departure. The phrase, "the real Charles," can be misleading if it suggests that Wallace discovered a hidden monster in a single night. The evidence supports something less theatrical and more consequential. She saw a man whose public suitability and private attachment didn't align. She saw that Camilla wasn't simply a closed chapter. She saw Charles choose Camilla's company while Wallace occupied the position of prospective wife. That was the information she acted on. The Queen Mother's official 80th birthday was 4 August 1980. The Windsor Castle ball associated with Wallace's breakup was probably earlier in the summer, and its exact date remains uncertain. The formal gown is undocumented. The crossing of the room is a later visual reconstruction. The quotations attributed to Wallace differ. The central fact survives those corrections. Charles spent most of the relevant evening with Camilla, and Anna Wallace ended the relationship. She didn't need a court circular to understand the arrangement. She didn't need a press scandal. She didn't need a future biography to tell her what the room had already shown. Diana's marriage followed on 29 July 1981. Wallace had left Charles in the summer of 1980. One woman had direct experience of the arrangement and acted on it. The other entered the same royal system with less age, less power, and less reliable information about the woman who remained at its center. Anna Wallace wasn't morally superior because she walked away. Diana wasn't morally inferior because she didn't. Their choices were made under different conditions. Wallace's importance lies in that difference. She saw enough, and she left.